Well, welcome to the Presbyterian Reformed Churchman. I'm Pastor George, and I am super excited about today's guest. We have ruling elder Mel Duncan with us. Mel, thanks for being on.
George, it's such a delight to be with you today. Thanks for having me.
Yes, absolutely. We want to talk about the Gospel Reformation Network, but first we want to talk a little bit about Mel. And so, Mel, tell us about yourself. I mean, I think most people know who you are, but most of us don't really know who you are. So tell us who Mel is.
You're very kind to ask. And George, it's a delight to be on the podcast. I love what you're doing here, and I hope that ruling elders will get involved and will learn the language of the church and learn the personalities of the church. And I just want to commend you for trying to help bring the church together through this wonderful podcast. I'm a son.
Thanks for saying, by the way.
Well, I mean it. I really do mean it. I'm the son of two wonderful Christian parents, Ligon Duncan and Shirley Duncan, who almost 50 years ago were a young couple interested in a new venture known as the Presbyterian Church in America. And my father had moved to Greenville after serving in World War II, and he had worked in different places around the state of South Carolina, and his company moved him to Greenville. My mom had just come to Greenville to teach at Furman, and they met and married thanks to good people at my home church, Second Pres Greenville, and they raised a family. And along the way, a godly PCA founding father named Gordon Reed encouraged my father to become first a deacon and then an elder. And then really trained him and reconnected him to his heritage, his Reformation heritage, but more importantly to his to Christian conviction. And so Mom and Dad were part of a wonderful group of people in the early 1970s who used their energy and their love for the church to help bring about the PCA. I was born in 1970. I grew up in the city of Greenville, and I kind of think of it as my little part of the Shire, to use Middle Earth language. It's my little Hobbiton, and went to local schools and then went to Clemson nearby for college, and then came home and got involved in the family printing business, and have been involved with Christian publishing, media, in one way or another my whole adult life. And I have spent some time on the road. I've served for a number of years at Ligonier Ministry, doing development work and church relations work, and then have done the same for some other organizations. And recently, about a decade now, I've been working as a church administrator here in Greenville. I'm a Sunday school teacher. I'm a dad. I also am an active ruling elder, and am delighted to be Rick Phillips' executive assistant and help a medium-sized PCA church in a wonderful American city that's really going through kind of a golden age right now. And I love trying to help the elders and the deacons of the church with some of the business side of things. So for a number of years, I've kind of looked to the model of the way PCA coordinators work. My job is to be a resource to the leadership of the session, and to assist the diaconate and the various ministries that are a part of Second Church do their work. And I do four primary things here. I assist the senior minister. I promote our media and outreach. I work with our volunteers. About 100 people a week who are members of Second Pres do some kind of volunteering to do the outreach of Second Church, both on Sundays and throughout the week. And then lastly, I work with our wonderful staff to try to connect all the threads of life and ministry together so that Sundays can be both enjoyed by our people, but also people can be deployed faithfully and necessarily and correctly to serve visitors and members alike. I'm a father of three. I have a 17-year-old son. I'm very proud to report that he is the two-time South Carolina State Scholastic chess champion, And he is a big brother to two beautiful younger sisters, Frances, the Swamp Fox, and Mary Elizabeth, who is the social chairman of the Duncan family, who, along with my wife Linda, make my house a home, and love being a dad. And,
that's awesome.
So I love. I like to say I'm not sure exactly where family, church, and work begin or end, because they're all kind of part of the same thing. But I love working in the church. I've done this intentionally now for 10 years, though I've been an officer in the PCA for about half my life. And then I've been a front row spectator to watching the PCA grow as a new denomination and now as a half-century-old denomination. You may know me through doing the resolution of thanks at the PCA General Assembly, having had a father that was interested in Presbyterian history. I've loved over the years working with a gentleman who's now in glory with the Lord, a fellow named Henry Louis Smith, crafting those, and I've done about a dozen of them, and I enjoy kind of telling the story of the PCA each year through that. But I also enjoyed serving on committees of the church, and in recent years, my pastor, Dr. Richard Phillips, and Dr. John Payne have asked me to get involved with the Gospel Reformation Network. And so, like a lot of ruling elders who show up to a meeting and notice that they're the only ruling elder there, I realized I was going to be assigned some new responsibilities, and I've enjoyed doing that now for about 10 years, and I enjoy helping the GRN put on its events and do its communication.
Yeah, wow, okay. So so many things you said I want to key on. First of all, you are a native of Greenville. Is the church where you're working and serving, is that the church you grew up in?
It is a little unusual. It is the church I grew up in, and it's awesome. I like to say I love my church, and I love telling people about my church. Second Presbyterian Church is 130 years old, and I like to tell people it's a Reformed church, it's an old church, and it's a new church all at the same time. We have roots in the Protestant Reformation, and at the same time, we have roots in the 19th century. Our founding fathers and mothers were Civil War veterans who were part of Reconstruction era Greenville, and we were a daughter church of the historic Big Steeple in downtown Greenville. And we also went through a long period, like a lot of downtown churches, of sort of a mainline malaise. And the Lord sent us a wonderful gospel minister named Gordon Reed, who baptized me and my brothers, who really, I like to say Gordon Reed got our heart right. We really were a church that was beginning to change, and Gordon came through and taught us the gospel and taught us Reformed theology and discipled young men like my dad. And he was involved in the early days of getting RTS started. He was an enthusiastic supporter of RTS, and he also was very active in starting the PCA. You know, there were a number of those men, George, in that generation who all came out of Old Columbia Seminary, which is the old PCUS seminary in Atlanta that birthed so many founding fathers of the PCA. I think it's the institution more than any other that shaped the founding of the PCA. And there were a number of conservative men who were watching the old denomination progressively slip and change its theological identity. And they became sort of the shock troops for the beginning of the PCA. And so Gordon Reed was one of those men. Gordon really reoriented Second Church around Reformed theology, and we've kind of been going in a direction that he replanted us ever since then, and we're grateful for that. Paul Settle, who was another PCA founding father, who had notable ministry in a number of different places, followed Gordon here at Second, and Paul was known as a real scholar and a real a pulpiteer, an esteemed preacher, and he was the PCA's first Christian education director. And that was the same impact that he had at Second. He really equipped us theologically promoted Bible learning and scholarship. My brother had a sense of call to the ministry during Paul's time here, and really ever since then, Second has been a thoroughgoing, ever reforming church, and we still got a long way to go. But I feel like we're in a good direction. In recent years, Rick Phillips came here, and the Lord has used Rick in a mighty way to help. I mentioned we're a Reformed church. We're an old church. In a lot of ways, we're a new church, George. Most of the congregation, I think overwhelmingly, most of the congregation are folks who have joined the church in the last 5 or 7 years. And we've actually grown dramatically in the last couple of years. And the Lord seems to be blessing and sending forth His Spirit right now in Greenville. So, yes, I'm sitting a block off of Main Street in downtown Greenville in my office. If you probably will hear some of the sounds of the city. There's been a fire alarm going off across the street off and on today, and Greenville's just a great place. It's just a beautiful little city. It's kind of tucked away midway between Atlanta and Charlotte. And there's a lot of things happening along the I-85 corridor. It's headed up towards your way. There's just sort of one big, ever-expanding area, and we're blessed by having a conservative business and moral climate, but we're progressive in the best sense of the word as well. Oftentimes, as something begins in my state, it'll begin in Greenville first, and there still is a vital Christian witness in Greenville. For the first century or so of Greenville's history, Furman was kind of a conservative bulwark in the Greenville region, and in recent years, Bob Jones has been that. And so oftentimes when you meet somebody from Greenville, the first thing they'll ask is, where do you go to church? And we're blessed to have about 300 churches in Greenville County, many of which are evangelical. We have 15 PCA churches in Greenville County, which is a very unusual. There are not a lot of places that are blessed to have that big a concentration. And then Calvary Presbytery, which is upcountry South Carolina, has about 43 churches. So we're really blessed to be a real center of Reformed people and witness.
Yeah, praise God. I mean, I'm in a presbytery with Winston-Salem, Greensboro, surrounding areas, and we only have about a dozen churches. And there's not a lot of Reformed presence where we are. There are some ARP churches, also some. Neil Stewart's church is in Greensboro, and that's a blessing. Yeah. So that's it's amazing. I watched Greenville from afar grow up. Yeah. And I used to have to plan my travel like based on Atlanta traffic. Right. Now I got to factor in Greenville traffic. Right. Yeah. And it really seems like the city planning there didn't foresee what has happened in that area, because the roads don't fit the cars. Right.
They paved the old goat tracks, I think, and just wherever there was a path, they paved it. Yeah, Greenville's grown up dramatically. In Greenville County, South Carolina, George, there are more Fortune 500 companies per capita than any other county in the United States. Wow. And a lot of that is anchored by the big BMW and Michelin and some of the big companies. They like Greenville because it's near Atlanta, which is the distribution hub, and it's near Charlotte, which is where all the money is. And there's a good quality of life here. And so there are a lot of companies that'll like to kind of park right here in Greenville because they're close to major networks.
Yes. Okay. So still got a few more questions before we get to the GRN. Yeah. So I like I love the story of how you came on staff at your church, and in a sense, it's similar to mine. I mean, I was a deacon and then a ruling elder. Yeah. And I used to be an engineer, and so because of some administrative giftings, they brought me on staff. Yeah. And I came under care at the same time. I was a executive pastor. Yeah. And so I get that, the decently in order, and just being able to really facilitate the work of ministry within the church. Yeah. I think I think more and more churches are moving to that, even medium-sized churches, because there's you can't have ministries tripping over one another, and it causes frustration for people who are primarily volunteers, and their time is limited, and so. Did you, when you came on staff to do that, were you replacing somebody who was doing? So you're like, I did the same thing. I was the first one in two churches.
We were guinea pigs, George.
Yes, and, you have to navigate very difficult things.
You do, and I'm grateful that our volunteers as well as our members have been very gracious. As not only I try to learn this church in an administrative way, but that we try to do some new things together, and volunteers in churches are amazing gifts from God. And what you want to try to do is suggest and help. You don't want to try to industrialize anything. You want to treat it like you would your family, and yet you want to try to make things better where you can. And churches oftentimes do things really well in some ways and may be blind to other things. And so we try to give attention to ministries that are working well, but also to ministries that, sometimes it's okay to let ministries go stop. And so a lot of what I do is communication. I try to make sure everybody knows what else is happening, and so that we aren't tripping over one another, and we try to spread the resources of the church out fairly. We just have some wonderful people who volunteer in every kind of way. Prison ministry, hospitality, the local public schools. We do a wonderful outreach there. Outreach to young people, to college, to our neighborhood. We have some evangelism ministry that's really remarkable that takes place on Main Street every week, and you try to make sure the calendar and the resources and the oversight is all there, and you got to encourage. People need to be encouraged. They're doing hard things, and they're doing it on their own time without being paid for it. So you try to balance all those things, and then it's a real joy as a ruling elder to be on a staff with someone like Rick Phillips. Rick is, many would know him, but he has just a remarkable life experience. He had been in the Army. His father and his grandfather had been in the Army. His grandfather was George Patton's aide-de-camp. And
wow.
I mean, it's just, but in addition to that, he's a person who came to know the Lord later in life. And so he has the zeal of an adult convert. Here's a young man who wanders into 10th Pres in Philadelphia and is converted under the preaching of Jim Boyce. And he has a Boycean kind of ministry. He loves to declare God's word. He loves to write commentaries on God's word. But along the way in life, he also picked up a Wharton business degree. And wow. So he's just a remarkable person. And I've yet to encounter something in my job that walking across the hall and asking my boss, how do I do this? I've yet to be not rewarded by him. And he's a good man, and he's a delight to work for. And we've got some young ministers on staff that are just beginning their ministerial careers. And I love speaking into the life of young ministers. In God's goodness, this church has been able to place 25 men more than 25 men into full-time PCA ministry.
That's phenomenal.
And now part of that is because we have RTS and Greenville Seminary nearby, and we've been blessed to have young men who've been drawn to the ministry of the church. But it's been a great opportunity for our deacons and ruling elders to really hands-on get involved with young men and be a part of their lives. And a lot of those young men have married daughters of our church, and so we feel like we've got family throughout the PCA. And one of the things I most enjoy about the PCA, aside from just being a part of an institution God ordained for the benefit of his people, is the connection that you have in this world to people all over the world. And, we, as an older church, we've got some just gloriously old relationships with missionaries, with institutions. It's really just a delight to go to General Assembly or to a Presbytery meeting and to see God's hand through the generations in people and institutions that in a small little way, Second Pres Greenville's been able to be a part of.
Wow. So I do think, I know we have future conversations planned, you and I, but now we have to add one because I love the idea about just, again, the executive pastor, the executive director. What are you known as, your position there?
I've told them I don't care what they call me as long as the check clears. So my title is church administrator. Church administrator,
okay.
Yeah.
Because what I found is even if churches don't have somebody full-time doing that, that is a function and role that a lot of ruling elders fill.
Yeah.
And, like you hit on some things, like sometimes ministries have to close and our job is there to support, and I'd love to have that conversation with you, but I know we want to get to the Gospel Reformation Network.
Yeah.
Oh, one more thing. I love the testimony of the church where you and Rick are, just the idea that you grew up there and you're on staff there, that you're training up leaders and sending them out. That's a beautiful model of what a church is supposed to be. And in our world today, things are becoming more and more transient. In South Florida, I remember in a 10-year period, our membership numbers, I was at a church, it was St. Andrew's Presbyterian Church. It's called Park Road Pres now. But our numbers were stagnant for 10 years. And we kept having this thought that we just lose people, And so I did a membership analysis, and in 10 years, we had 200 people leave the church and 200 people come in the church, and that's why our numbers were stagnant. So getting 200 people is good, It's but we lost 200, and 50 of those passed away, and 100 of those moved away.
Yeah.
And then the other 50 were on us. But so it is something to have, Meadowview, where I'm at now, it's just beautiful. There's 4 generations in multiple families at our church. Yeah. And yet it's not a church that's ingrown of just families. We're having new people come all the time. So I think the future of the PCA is really bright, because every guy I'm talking to is saying the same thing. They have new people coming to their church. And I know your heart is for the PCA. One thing you didn't mention is you're the clerk of your presbytery, and that's just another amazing thing. But the Gospel Reformation Network is really there to promote healthy gospel churches in the PCA. So that's where I want to go, because what's your position at the GRN, and how is the GRN formed? And let's start a conversation there.
Yeah, well, thank you. The Gospel Reformation Network began as a conversation a decade and a half ago. There were some concerns in the PCA about particularly how sanctification was being taught and discussed, and there were a number of different meetings, some of which brought together people who disagreed on the issues. There was a meeting in Atlanta 15 years ago now, I think, where some of the folks at the PCA building brought together people from the different parts of the PCA to talk about it, and that led to some ministers in the Tennessee area putting together a group to do some formal teaching on this, and then different people kind of came together and formed what became known as the Gospel Reformation Network. My pastor was one of those men, along with Ligon Duncan and John Payne and Harry Reeder and some others at that time. The organization met and had a conference in 2013 during the Greenville General Assembly. It was the 43rd General Assembly. They actually had an event here at our church here, and the council members asked if I would help organize the event. which I was happy to do. And then after that event, they asked if I would come on to the leadership team to help do some administration for the GRN. And so my participation with the GRN began formally in 2013. So it's been 10 years I've been a part of it. The stated purpose of the GRN, our purpose statement is we want to cultivate healthy, Reformed churches in the PCA. And we're mindful of the fact that there are a lot of different voices speaking into the PCA, and we wanted to have a network that would be something like a think tank and a place that could promote and distill good Reformed theology and promote good philosophy of ministry for churches. And so we sort of reorganized in the mid-teens, and we started having yearly conferences and then yearly lunches at General Assembly. And we've done websites and we've done seminars, and we tried to take advantage of places where we can teach and proclaim. We've developed these vision and distinctive statements. We call them the 7 couplets. That in a lot of ways, George, it's just good Presbyterian philosophy of ministry kind of things. Biblical fidelity and confessional integrity, gospel-driven and Christ-exalting ministry, earnest prayer and expository preaching, intentional evangelism and personal discipleship, godly leadership and Presbyterian polity, Reformed worship and vibrant community, missional clarity and church multiplication. These are the things that animate our organization. And we think that these are at the very heart of what being a healthy PCA church ought to look like. It's going to look a little bit different even amongst the council members. Our churches are going to be a little different, but each of our churches are going to be marked by these common sense Presbyterian Reformed ideas. And what we want to do is we want to be a healthy network serving a healthy denomination. You know that, George, there are dozens of networks in the PCA, and I'm not saying that's a good thing or a bad thing. I'm just saying that there are a lot of them, and some of them have very narrow purposes. Some of them have very broad purposes. What we want to do is just have a biblical purpose to our network, and we want to encourage PCA churches to not be afraid to tread the old paths and to not lose confidence in the means of grace, and to not be afraid to be distinctively Reformed. And we're trying to say that not in a dogmatic way, but in a winsome way. And we're trying to do that in a way that speaks not just to one segment of the church or one faction of the church, but speaks to the heart of the PCA. We have, over the years, engaged in some high-profile conversations. I think back to the early days of the PCA, GRN leaders were involved in some really high-profile conversations over the issues of sanctification. Nowadays, it would be very easy to reference Tully and Chivijan and to talk about some of the antinomian errors associated with his ministry, both in terms of its teaching and his practice. But back then we didn't name call. We didn't try to humiliate Tullian. We really tried to drive people to the theological conversation, and sometimes we've been very successful. Sometimes our critics, we've met with them and we've tried to have conversations. We've been criticized for doing that as well. But the main thing I'd want to say to your viewers and your listeners is that the GRN is a meat and potatoes PCA organization that any PCA church ought to resonate with. And in a sense, any PCA church ought to feel welcome to be a part of. We're just trying to help PCA churches communicate faithfully Presbyterian and Reformed distinctives, and to network with one another and to build the church up. So that's a little bit on the GRN.
Yes, yeah. And so what's your title there?
I think my title is administrator.
Okay.
We're about a decade ago, the organization used to be run through the deacons of Second Pres Greenville, and the organization had grown, and we were having churches that were contributing some money to us, and so the deacons of our church came to me and said, Mel, we think it's time for the GRN to form its own nonprofit organization. And so the council members and myself put together a legal entity, a 501c3 entity, and formed a nonprofit here in South Carolina. And I think I am the registered agent of that entity. And so I guess technically that would be my title. But again, I do whatever John and the council tells me to do. We're really looking forward to our events this year, and we've had some spectacular events in years past. And so what I do is I try to resource the GRN effectively, and I try to connect our message to our venues and to our speakers and so forth. So I administrate the GRN.
You administrate, yes. Yeah. So let me tell you a little bit about my history with the GRN. And so I was, about 4 years ago, I was I probably would have been viewed as a moderate. I was in 2018, I was the moderator of South Florida Presbytery. And guys on the right identified with me and guys on the left identified with me. And so people really didn't know how to peg me. And I just thought I was a moderate. When the revoice stuff started happening in 2019, I moved up here to North Carolina, and like you said, you guys meet with people on all sides. You're willing to talk, and so even in the forums, I would be having conversations, and people didn't know where I was coming from because I would just be asking questions. And I really just believe in, like, I want to be able to identify the other side's arguments the way they would want them to be identified, but also like challenge people on their arguments. And so obviously 2020 happened. I'm getting more involved in discussions online. People are, and still people don't know how to peg me. So the GRN comes in 2021. It's in Birmingham. And I was just really on the fence up until the week of it. And I said, I really want to check these guys out. And here's my impression. I said, I think I agree with GRN identifying guys. I mean, the council I never had a problem with. I mean, I loved the council, obviously. I loved Harry Reeder. I loved all the talks, John Payne. I would listen to him. And then guys that would identify. I said, I think I agree more with the GRN. But the guys that are against them, I often find are nicer. And, whatever language, nuanced, winsome, beautiful, whatever language we want to put to them, so I said, I want to meet these guys. And again, I'm not talking about the council. I'm talking about everybody that's rallying behind the vision, And so it was kind of funny because I get to that 2021 conference, and a number of guys came up to me and go, not council members, but just general guys are like, "You're here?" And I'm like, "Why do you guys say that?" Like, I'm as conservative come. I'm not far right, but I'm, why? Because I challenge you, sometimes. Right. But that was only an initial thing. Right. I ended up leaving the conference with so many new friendships, so much alignment in the vision and the direction. So much of it made sense. The talks were the sequence of the talks. First of all, the talk caliber. I mean, I'm a guy. You worked at Ligonier. I'm a guy that would go to Ligonier every year when I was in South Florida. I mean, I've been to I don't know how many. Yeah. And so, I mean, the highest of caliber of reformed presenters would be at Ligonier, and I felt like I was getting that caliber or better at this conference. And men singing. I mean, when we sang "Holy, Holy, Holy," at Briarwood, and just. I was like, man, this is a vision, a message, a way of ministry that not only can I get behind, I want to, they call me to want to be better and to want to, encourage others to see the beauty of what is being presented. And so I was a believer. In the meantime, PCA churches were, two new denominations formed, or presbyteries. Churches are leaving. Yeah. Our church is very frustrated about a lot of what we see. And my elders are questioning, is it time that we go, And so last year, because I think you know what was great about, like you said, I think I'm starting to figure you out, George. Yeah, I like to be fun and laugh and joke and just kind of, self-promote, but in a self-deprecating way. And so I was going everywhere to all you guys saying, I think I got the most people here at this conference. I want an award. But we did. We brought the whole session.
You did.
I think
you sure did. Yeah.
I think 2 guys couldn't come, but then we brought a ruling elder we were training. And we brought an emeritus, an older gentleman that was one of almost the founders here at Meadowview. And they all left with the same impression. And they said, wow, these are churches and guys that love the Lord and want to seek his glory, are dedicated, committed to the PCA's mission, to the scriptures, to the Reformed tradition, but the Great Commission, like they care about the gospel spreading. And so, I just want to say I'm a believer and I appreciate it. And somehow I managed my way on to the general council there, but I didn't ask to be on it. I was invited, not like I asked for an award for bringing all those people.
And we're delighted that you're on the council, George. Well, and let me say your story is not all that different than most of the people in the PCA. I think the last 4 or 5 years have been really confusing times for PCA people. And I think one of the reasons the GRN spoke so directly to the issues presented by Revoice is because Revoice is an issue of an error of sanctification. And it's a basic category error of sanctification. And the homosexuality is the trigger issue, but the category seems to be to every I like to say every Sunday school teacher in the PCA can understand, the errors of sanctification and Revoice. It's just a certain group of people can't. And the GRN felt no one was speaking to this issue. A number of GRN council members, myself among them, individually offered some remedies that first year after Revoice. I promoted first to my session and then to our Presbytery, and then I was privileged to advocate on the floor of GA the Nashville statement as an immediate response to the errors of Revoice. And then we've been engaged, as you have, George, and your session has been, individually to try to promote good language reform in the BCO to strengthen the PCA's process standards, so that we can do a better job communicating on this. But yeah, the GRN hosted a number of very high profile events in which we tried to directly critique the theology of Revoice, and there were howls to the moon about that. And we've just very patiently but ploddingly we've kept pushing on this, because there's not a confusion on our end about Revoice, and the PCA is not ever going to embrace side B gay Christianity, period. And a couple of years ago, a lot of churches in the PCA were just like Meadowview. Is the PCA really going to do this? Is the PCA really going to slip in this area? And I'm so pleased. I wish in some ways it would be more than it is, but I'm so pleased that the PCA has begun to respond and has begun to correct the errors that Revoice has brought into our church. And I feel like the GRN has been a big part of helping set the table in this conversation. And I think the heart of the PCA has said amen to that. We have some critics that are never going to acknowledge that, and that's fine. They have a right to do that. I just wish they would do it out in the light of day, like the GRN does. We don't do anything that we don't broadcast or publish or sign our name to, and we're always going to do it that way, George.
Yes, and that's helpful, and I agree. I think what the GRN did is, and really it was grassroots. I mean, I know it's an organization, it's a 501c3, but the grassroots networks of relationships that have developed around it, you know, we're talking, we're collaborating, we're trying to, and I think also like the GRN, it was a Kevin DeYoung talk, probably at GA. It was, but I don't know where it was given. I would guess it was a Kevin DeYoung talk at GA about concupiscence. Yeah. And I would say that talk taught more people about this whole discussion about desire, temptation, indwelling sin, and all that. I mean, I don't know how many views that video has, if it's a lot or not. I would guess it was a lot because everybody was referencing it, and it really helped us to understand what our standards teach on that. And when I say us, I'm just saying the collective, the PCA. You know, because I saw guys in forums contradicting what our standards say, you know, and once all this came about, there was education there for people, and it absolutely was helpful, and it's given us language and vocabulary to use and to try to, and I will say you're right. You said it earlier. It's not a uniform group of guys. There's a spectrum of differences on the GRN for sure, and that comes out in different ways. But there is a brotherhood there that, again, I was welcomed in, and it's certainly helped, you know. And I think so. You said an interesting thing. You said that every Sunday school teacher in the PCA gets what we're talking about. Explain that a little more. That's going to be controversial, I think.
Well, sure, but I don't think revoice is all that complicated. I think for folks who have family members that are struggling with homosexuality and same-sex attraction, revoice was a kind of fool's gold for them, that it wasn't what it really seemed to be. I mean, for me, a clarifying moment was when our friends at Harvest USA, which is a good godly ministry, tried to communicate, no on revoice. And then you watched the sainted Rosaria Butterfield make her comments, and you I don't know how closely you paid attention to it, but just the horror that the revoice community turned on her. And then you've watched the progression of revoice. I mean, I think for any of your viewers or listeners who listen to either Harry Reeder each day do his worldview, or an Al Mohler do his worldview, the new morality is coming. And, the PCA has tried to deal with the L and with the G, and now we're fixing to deal with the T, and there's a plus after that who knows what's coming after that. And revoice doesn't have an answer for that. Revoice is a posture, and it's closely aligned with Preston Sprinkle and the spiritual friendship movement. And I'm just here to tell you, and I'm going to say it again, there's not a Sunday school teacher in the PCA that is going to let side B gay Christianity come through on their watch. And I think there are a lot of good people in the PCA who need to be reminded still that revoice is unhelpful, it's unwise, it's not really Reformed, it's really Catholic, and at least the theologians of revoice are not Reformed, and it's just not helpful. And I'm glad that the host church has taken themselves out of the PCA. I think it's time to get their jargon out of the PCA as well too. And my sense is, George, that the PCA is not confused about this. Maybe some of our establishment figures in the PCA, for whatever reason, are. But I think the fact that the PCA year after year is trying to fix the language in the BCO needs to be a message that folks need to hear, that the PCA is not going to give an inch to side B gay Christianity, period, end of story.
On the one hand, I want to say yes and amen. On the other hand, I'm like, we're not going to. Yeah, as a denomination, I'll agree with you. I think individual presbyteries, individual churches, and individual teaching elders are giving, space to this. And I think, but I agree what you said, too, about the T. So in last year's Revoice talks, the T, they started saying we're going to have to include the T. Yeah. And I'll say there's nothing to stop the MAPs either, the minor attracted persons. That was one of the very first things that was asked of Greg Johnson in that cross-politic interview. Well, would you do the conference for, and he said, well, we'd have to think about that, And of course there's forgiveness and we want to minister to people with all kinds of struggles. Yeah. But for me, Mel, what this has always been about is once the sanctification piece was done, like with the AIC report, with the teaching, I believe the sanctification piece is mostly done. For me, it's the identity piece. And when I say that, people say you're just concerned with language. And I said, no. I'm not concerned with language. I'm concerned with what the language communicates. It is a false anthropology, a false idea and conception of what it means to be a person, what it means to be a human, particularly a person in Christ. So it's in philosophical terms, it's an ontological issue. It's the nature of being. In theological terms, it's anthropology. And so when guys say we're not arguing over theology, I say, well, anthropology is a category of systematics. What is a human? What is a person who is in Christ? And, it's one thing to use struggles, temptations, and desires as descriptive of experience, of the ongoing effects of indwelling sin. I'm all for being open about that. It's another thing to say that puts me in a category of personhood that is, again, in my words, somehow ontological, being. And this is the big difference between, you mentioned Rosaria Butterfield. Are you familiar with Becket Cook at all?
Sure.
So, Becket is phenomenal because I think Rosaria sometimes comes across as like kind of curmudgeonly and, some people don't appreciate Rosaria. I think she's wonderful.
She's a real scholar.
Yeah, she is. Yeah. She's very no nonsense. You know what I mean? Like she's like the opposite of winsome, I guess. Yeah. Even though I think she can be very sweet. But like Becket Cook is a man who is same-sex attracted, who was married to a man, or at least in a long-term relationship in Hollywood, like in the culture, with movie stars and set designers and makeup artists. And he flat out rejects Revoice. He retracted his recommendation for Greg Johnson's book, and he has said he is against side B Christianity, gay Christianity. And I just wish our people in the PCA would listen to these voices. It is not simply a language thing. For Becket and Rosaria, it's not simply how we refer to ourselves. It's what that communicates to a world that is telling kids who are confused about identity and gender and sexuality. And the best that Revoice has to tell them is, well, you might be that, but you can abstain from it, you know? And
George,
we have such a better message.
Yeah, we do. And I'm hopeful that better message is going to carry. I really do. I think the PCA is getting better at articulating a gracious response to Revoice. And I think other than those who are committed to it, I think on a denominational level, we're getting better and better on it. Now, presbyteries are going to handle things differently. And some presbyteries are afraid to have this kind of a theological discussion. And I actually would love for this discussion to happen in my presbytery, not because my presbytery would embrace revoice, but because we've got some wonderful, careful, loving theologians who would graciously critique it in such a way that would correct the error, but also love the man struggling with it. And I think the PCA's report, I think most of us know that Kevin DeYoung is responsible for a good bit of that, though Dr. Chappell and Dr. Keller did some excellent work on that too, as well as the other members of the committee. That's a great place to start this conversation. And that report does not in any way give Revoice a get-out-of-jail card. There are folks in the PCA that just can't handle existentially that comment or that discussion, but it is what it is. And, the tendencies, the strong Reformed institutions that the PCA serves, but also that feed into the PCA are getting better and better on responding to Revoice. And so I'm encouraged by that, George. I know there's some brothers out there who don't want to talk about it because they don't want to deal with it. But I actually think we've got some more conversations to have about this before the PCA lands where it needs to. And I think we're getting closer each year to doing that.
Yeah. And just to kind of close that out. So there's a number of overtures coming through now that I think have really addressed the concerns of the past 2 years' overtures with the language issues and the singling this out issue and what does this mean. And so I'm looking forward. I think they're, Meadowview passed one that while it failed our presbytery, Piedmont Triad Presbytery has roundly failed these left and right, and it was a tie vote, 17-17. In other words, we got a few guys in the middle because we handled some of their concerns, and I think that's going to be the goal. There are going to always just be those guys that don't want to deal with the language piece of it, but then there's others in the middle that it just needs, and we only need to get about 4 or 5 presbyteries. So, I'm looking forward to that. But Mel, as we wrap up this conversation, tell us about the Gospel Reformation Network conference coming up. I want people to register for it. It's in my backyard, so I'll get to say hi to you.
We are excited to be in your backyard. We're going to be in Charlotte on May the 3rd and 4th. Our venue is going to be the Sovereign Grace PCA Church in Charlotte. It's a fantastic, beautiful building. Go to gospelreformation.net, and you'll see everything you need to know about that event. We're going to have a bookstore. We're going to have some food options. We're going to have some fantastic vendors. We're so excited about our partner vendors that are helping us do that. Some of the very best seminaries that serve the PCA are involved in this, and we're also excited about having Kevin DeYoung and Harry Reeder and Jonathan Master, but also let me say one of the real treats at this year is going to be Dr. O. Palmer Robertson. Yes. Dr. Robertson is a treasure of the PCA. I think he lives in Winston-Salem. You probably get to see him a good bit. Dr. Robertson has taught it everywhere you can teach that serves the PCA. He taught at Knox. Right. He taught at Covenant. He was one of my brother's professors at seminary. He has a time at Westminster, a time at RTS, and famously was a missionary to Africa. And Palmer was really the great speech of last year's GA, emerging out of the mist like Elijah the Tishbite on the floor of General Assembly. Yes. And telling God's people what God's word is. And Dr. Robertson also, in his 8th decade of life, is a thoroughgoing, gracious gentleman, and I'm looking forward to his message. He specifically asked John to speak on the topic, and we're just, like our other GRN events, George, this is a chance for people throughout the PCA to come together. Oftentimes it's the singing at these events that you end up remembering. But it's a chance to be restored, to connect with folks a month before General Assembly, to connect with one another, and to be a part of a great event. GospelReformation.net is where people should go.
Absolutely. Yes. I'm so glad you said that about Palmer. He has been a true blessing. He's become, I don't know if you can be a friend with a guy who's a father in the faith like that, but so prolific. He's writing, he's finishing his life's work on the covenant, and it's awesome. So he's going to be our mission speaker, conference speaker at Meadowview. We do ours in the fall, and so we're looking forward to that. And he'll be a real blessing. And the man has energy. Yeah. So he's in his 80s, and he's got more energy than most
really
people.
Does.
So
really does.
Well, this is great, Mel. So you have any final words before we wrap up, or I'll just take us out?
I just want to thank you again for being on the program today, and I hope that Reformed folk who are interested in the PCA, if you're a deacon or a ruling elder, you won't be afraid and you won't be distracted from getting involved. We've had a resurgence of Reformed churchmen that are just plain ruling elders, and they have made all the difference in the world. And I hope that this podcast and the work of the GRN empowers you to stay involved in the PCA. There's no problem in the PCA that won't be remedied by more ruling elders getting involved in the work of the courts of the church. So I hope I've encouraged some of those folks today to sign up for Presbytery, to sign up for General Assembly, and to take their turn serving the church in its national and regional meetings.
Well, you're welcome, Mel, and thank you, and thanks for that encouragement. I know people will be encouraged it's people like to get to know people they're hearing about and seeing about, and I think you've done that well. You're a gracious, fun guy. And so this is, again, the Presbyterian and Reformed Churchman, and if this is helpful to you, feel free to share it with other ruling elders. We look forward to the Gospel Reformation Network Conference May 3rd and 4th at Sovereign Grace Presbyterian Church in Charlotte, North Carolina. Thanks again, Mel.
Thanks.